Welcome back to the series on St. John of Damascus's On the Orthodox Faith. We are still in Book 1. We're looking at Chapter 3, where John of Damascus gives proofs for God's existence. So we'll take a look at that today, and we'll first start with the reading. In the timestamps below, I'll separate out the reading, so if you don't want to listen to me read the whole thing, you can either read it on your own or just skip that portion, and then I'll make some comments about it as usual. Now, the fact that God exists is not doubted by those who accept the sacred scriptures, both the Old and New Testaments, nor by the majority of the Greeks, for as we have said, the knowledge of God's existence has been revealed to us through nature. However, since the wickedness of the evil one has so prevailed over men's nature as even to drag some of them down to the most unspeakable and extremely wicked abyss of perdition, and to make them say that there is no God, of whose folly the prophet David said, "The fool hath said in his heart there is no God," then the Lord's disciples and apostles, made wise by the all-Holy Spirit, did by his power and grace show signs from God and draw up those people alive in the net of their miracles from the depths of the ignorance of God to the light of his knowledge. Similarly, the shepherds and teachers who succeeded to their grace of the Spirit and by the power of their miracles and the word of their grace enlightened those who were in darkness and converted those who were in error. Now, let us who have not received the gifts of miracles and teaching, because by our being given to material pleasures we have made ourselves unworthy, let us invoke the aid of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, and discuss some few of the things which the expounders of grace have handed down to us. All things are either created or uncreated. Now, if they are created, then they are also definitely changeable. For things whose being originated with a change are definitely subject to change, whether it be by corruption or by voluntary alteration. If, on the other hand, they are uncreated, then it logically follows that they are definitely unchangeable. For, of those things whose being is contrary, the manner of being, which is to say properties, is also contrary. Who then will not agree that all beings that fall within our experience, including even the angels, are subject to change and alteration and to being moved in various ways? The intellectual beings, by which I mean angels and souls and demons, change by free choice, progressing in good or receding, exerting themselves or slackening, whereas the rest change by generation or corruption, increase or decrease, change in quality or change in position. Consequently, things which are changeable must definitely be created. Created beings have certainly been created by something, but the Creator must be uncreated, for if he has been created, then he has certainly been created by someone else, and so on until we arrive at something which has not been created. Therefore, the Creator is an uncreated and entirely unchangeable being, and what else would that be but God? What is more, the very harmony of creation, its preservation and governing, teach us that there is a God who has put all this together and keeps it together, ever maintaining it and providing for it. For how could such contrary natures as fire and water, earth and air, combine with one another to form one world and remain undissolved, unless there were some all-powerful force to bring them together and always keep them that way? What is it that has ordered the things of heaven and those of earth, the things which move through the air and those which move in the water? Nay, rather, the things which preceded them, heaven and earth and the natures of fire and water. What is it that combined and arranged them? What is it that set them in motion and put them on their unceasing and unhindered courses? Or is it that they had no architect to set a principle in them, all by which the whole universe be moved and controlled? But who is the architect of these things? Or did not he who made them also bring them into being? We shall certainly not attribute such power to spontaneity, even grant that they came into being spontaneously. Then whence came their arrangement? Let us grant this also if you wish. Then, what maintains and keeps the principles by which they subsisted in the first place? It is most certainly some other thing than mere chance. What else is this, if it's not God? We have this, right in the first chapter, we have this nice nod to the Psalms here. The wickedness of the evil one has so prevailed over men's nature. That's going to include intellect, the will, as even to drag some of them down to the most unspeakable, sometimes this is translated as irrational, an extremely wicked abyss of perdition, and to make them say that there is no God. And then this is, of course, taken from the prophet David. The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. I like this from St. John of Damascus. The unspeakableness of this, the irrationality of it, just so different than our modern era today. But let's go ahead and jump right in. I mean, I guess there is this section of the shepherds and teachers who succeeded. Let us who've not received the gifts of miracles and teaching. Why? Because we've been given over to pleasures more so. We've made ourselves unworthy. So we're invoking the aid of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, the triune God, so we can discuss these high, lofty things. And I think that's right to do when you're discussing arguments for the existence of God, the Trinity. These are extremely tough topics. As we'll see when we get to chapter 8, he's got this long section on the Trinity. He's pulling from works that come beforehand, and he's trying to go carefully, trying to address current issues of his day. Super interesting stuff. This first argument, I'm not going to reread it, but we see his first argument coming up here that all things are either created or uncreated. So the first thing we have, first premise you could say, is all beings are created or uncreated, all things. And then he goes into this really interesting argument. If they're created, so we can think about this as premise 2 maybe, if they're created, then they're necessarily subject to change. Now, what kinds of change and why are they subject to change? We can think about it this way. Since their being has its origin in change, they'll be altered by one of two things. Either they'll decay, like our bodies decay or our physical bodies decay, but you'll also be altered by deliberation, the rational thought process across time, right? We deliberate about things. Part of the reason we deliberate is because we have doubt about things. That is an alteration of the mind. So we have the alteration of the body, we have the alteration of the mind. Now, there's a line of thought that goes further back than John of Damascus. Augustine has this idea as well, and there are earlier thinkers too. But the idea is we're made from nothing. We're created out of nothing, and we're made from the dirt, right? The physical stuff that decays, and we're made from nothingness. And this nothingness is almost like a potency. I wouldn't quite call it that, but it's like a nothingness that is part of our being, and it allows for change. It's not a thing. It's a no thing. It's a nothing, right? Not no thing in the sense of not material, but it's non-being. We're made from nothing. So we are prone to change in the way that we decay and in the way that we deliberate or think. We'll get into sort of what does deliberation mean when we come to the incarnation? How does that work in the person of Christ later on, much later on in this work? But he's setting up for that in some ways. It's an old idea. So we have all beings are either created or uncreated. And then if they're created, they're subject to change. And that's either decay or deliberation. Our third premise is going to be something like, if they're uncreated, then they're necessarily unchangeable. They didn't come from nothing. They're outside of time, right? They're uncreated, so they're before time. They don't deliberate in the same way we do. And they're before anything in the sense of matter was created. So beings that are subject to change must be created, and created beings must have been created by someone uncreated. And if that's not the case, we would have an infinite regress, right? So think about that. If the contingent beings, the sorts of beings that are subject to change, if they have to be created, and created beings have to be created by someone that's uncreated, why is that the case? Well, if they were created by another created thing, then that created thing would be created by something, and then that created thing would be created by something. So we want to get out of this infinite regress. So we're postulating that there is an uncreated thing. And our conclusion then, Damascene's conclusion, the creator that is necessarily created, there is a creator that is necessarily uncreated and immutable. He doesn't change, and what else could that be but God? So that's sort of the first argument he gives us. A second one might not be as familiar to you. It's a bit confusing how he puts it here, but we see it in this wow, can't talk. We see it in this short section here. It goes something like this. Fire and water are contraries. Well, they're contrary natures, just as air and earth are. So you have to think fire, water, earth, air. Those are sort of the four elements of John of Damascus's day. And if fire and water and earth and air are contraries, but all things are made up of those things, it seems strange that contrary natures with contrary qualities can come together to form a holistic unit. And not only that, a holistic unit, but a unit that can sustain the world with contraries. And so you think of fire. Fire is dry and hot. Water is wet and cold. So how does something that's dry and hot, and how does something wet and cold come together as an elemental, fundamental thing of the world with contrary qualities to sustain the world, rather than like disintegrate or repel each other? So the conclusion then is there must be a rational, providential God who orders those things so that they do not repel each other. And he holds nature in balance in that way. So he must be rational. So Damascene asks here in this section, isn't there an architect of all these things, or a principle inherent in all of them by which the universe is moved, by which it's ordered and structured? And even if there were some sort of spontaneous process, he's going to say, let's just grant that a spontaneous process, I don't want to say created, but through a spontaneous process, all things came into existence. Even if that were the case, let's grant that. Then who orders them? Where does the order come from? Right? Why don't those things repel each other? Or why do they hold into existence? How are they perfectly balanced? You can hear a bit of the fine-tuning argument in there. And even if you grant that, okay, let's grant you spontaneity, let's grant you the spontaneous ordering as well, you're still left with another question, he says. This is the question of what maintains the underlying first principles that led to that spontaneity, even if the spontaneity resulted in order and resulted in creation. What is maintaining those principles in their order? And so we still have an infinite regress we have to answer. It seems like something, according to St. John of Damascus here, must maintain those things in existence and give them their order so that the things that they create are also maintained and ordered. So here's the key claim. The universe's internal order among these apparent contradictions like fire, water, air, earth, that is going to suggest some sort of rational force or source behind the world. Maybe to make this clearer, it's kind of interesting to look at some contemporary versions that I've written down here. So I already mentioned the fine-tuning argument. You can kind of hear pieces of that within St. John of Damascus here. But there's also something called the argument from cosmic contingency and order. So Swinburne talks about this. There's a physicist named Stephen Barr who talks about this. And I might not give you the argument exactly how they give it, but it's something along these lines. The first premise would be the universe contains contingent elements. So the contingent elements are like the contingent creation that we talked about earlier. Things that depend on something else for their existence. They don't have to exist, in other words. So the first premise would be something like the universe contains contingent elements, yet the universe behaves in law-like, stable, and intelligible ways. Intelligible ways means ways that are capable of being grasped by people with intellect. So the regularity that we see and grasp and the lawfulness that is present in the world, that calls for some sort of explanation. And why? Well, it just doesn't seem necessary in itself, as John of Damascus is pointing out here. So a source of rational order is going to be required. It seems like there needs to be a rationality to order these things rather than some necessity behind them. So that source then would be necessary and rational, and we'd call that source God. So that's the cosmic contingency and order argument. There was one more argument maybe that we could think of And maybe somebody like Edward Phaser or Thomas Aquinas has something similar to this. It's an argument from Act and Potency. I'm not saying that John of Damascus is making that argument here, but we can certainly make comparisons, and we have some similarities to draw from, in the sense of there must be something that unifies the elements of the world, even if it's not fire and water, maybe there's something that divides all beings, not just the four elements. And for Aquinas, for example, that's act and potency. So we can give the first premise as contraries cannot actualize themselves into a coherent whole without a unifying actuality. The coherent whole doesn't come about through the contraries themselves. They don't have the appropriate qualities and potencies to do that. The second premise would be all things composed of act and potency must be grounded in something that is pure act, which can actualize, but is not itself composed or changeable. Why? Because if it were composed of parts, it would be changeable. It would have potency. So this being that is pure act, this would be our conclusion, this being that's pure act is the sustaining cause of all other being. And we call that cause God. Now, I'm using principle, cause, Damascus here, Damascene's using principle and cause. But they're not arguing for, people who make these arguments, they're not arguing for some impersonal principle. So note the important part here for Damascus. He makes two arguments. The first is dealing with, there is this being, there's an author, a creator that's necessary. He's necessarily uncreated. He's necessarily immutable. That's God. The second, he's arguing for a principle, but a rational principle. A person, something like a person. Three persons, maybe. And then we get these other arguments, act and potency, the argument from cosmic contingency and order. We would need further arguments to argue for the exact triune God, but the idea here is that a God exists, and he gives us two very interesting arguments to think about that. After reading this chapter from Damascene, we should be left with this question: whether we're using the act and potency argument or the cosmic order argument or Damascene's own argument, we have to ask, what else could that first principle or pure act or uncreated being or all-powerful, providential, rational first principle, what could that thing be but God?